Hello, welcome. Since I made the emulator tier list video for Windows, there have been many comments about whether Ryujinx should be in the same tier as Sudachi or a bit lower, as I chose. So, in today's video, we'll compare these two excellent projects to finally settle this debate. If you decide to keep both emulators, which is more recommended, this video will serve as a guide to which project to choose for a specific game. As this video will be quite long, since I'll be covering over 30 games on 2 platforms, go ahead and give a like to support the production of more content like this. If you change your mind during the video, you can switch to a dislike. And if this is your first time on the channel, consider subscribing to get all the latest updates and news. Before we start the tests, let's go over some rules. All games will be running with the same mod and at the same resolution on both emulators. There will be no alterations in speed due to video editing. To determine which project delivers the best performance, we'll use unlocked FPS in compatible games. Of course, you won't be playing with the game running at super speed at home, but here we're only considering the FPS each emulator can deliver. At the end of each game's tests, I'll provide an overview with average, minimum, and maximum FPS, low 1%, and RAM and VRM usage. If a game encounters any crash or severe graphical issues, I'll mention it during the presentation. Remember, it's always good to have more than one emulator available. So, if possible, have multiple projects installed and ready to run your games. If you have a different opinion, feel free to leave a comment for respectful discussion. I'll read all comments. I won't provide downloads for games, and don't ask in the comments, as such content is prohibited on the platform. The first game we tested was Animal Crossing New Horizons. The good news is that you'll have good performance in this game on both emulators. The results are almost identical, varying depending on the environment you're viewing at the moment. One notable thing, at least in this game, is that both GPU and CPU usage is higher in Sudachi compared to Ryujinx. Therefore, if you have more modest hardware, you'll likely get better results with Ryujinx. In Astral Chain, which is a demanding game, there's a patch to enable 60 FPS, but it delays the audio during cutscenes. For this reason, I ran these 2 recordings without this patch, just with unlocked FPS. Even without the patch, Ryujinx still had delays during cutscenes. If a shader takes a bit longer to compile, cutscenes already show delays in Ryujinx, but there are no other graphical issues to mention. When we look at performance alone, the results are again similar, but Ryujinx makes better use of hardware, requiring fewer CPU and GPU resources to deliver the same performance, which also helps the system run cooler. Bayonetta 3, when it was released, was practically unplayable due to various issues, especially during cutscenes, which would get out of sync with the audio. Over time, these issues were fixed, and currently, playing on Sudachi, there's no longer a problem. On Ryujinx, however, the issue persists, and the longer the cutscene, the greater the delay between audio and video, potentially exceeding 10 seconds. Unlike other tests, which were done at standard resolution, here I used a mod to initially set the game to 900p and then doubled the resolution to 1800p. It's worth noting that the native quality of this game on the Switch is much lower, and several mods are needed to improve the image displayed in this video. In terms of performance, Ryujinx shows more noticeable stutters. Although it can achieve a higher FPS, it also suffers more drops, so when analyzing the average, Ryujinx managed only 2 FPS more than Sudachi. However, due to the cutscene delays, the experience on Ryujinx is compromised, making Sudachi the better choice for this game. In the case of Bowser's Fury, Sudachi once again stood out in performance compared to Ryujinx. Previously, I completed this game on Ryujinx because it had many issues on the now defunct Yuzu. However, after various updates to Yuzu and improvements to Sudachi, the game has become more optimized on the latter. Throughout the gameplay, there were no graphical issues, and Sudachi showed a performance gain of between 20% and 40% compared to Ryujinx. However, since the game runs at a normal speed limited to 60 FPS, the difference between emulators may not be very noticeable. We also tested Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, a game that is available for PC, but many prefer to emulate due to the high price of the PC version. The Switch version is capped at 30 FPS, making it difficult to analyze performance accurately. Thus, we focused on average FPS and low 1%, which show which emulator had fewer stutters. In our test, Sudachi achieved 20 FPS on low 1%, while Ryujinx had only 8 FPS. Additionally, Ryujinx showed higher hardware resource consumption. Another game we tested was Dragon Ball FighterZ, which also has a PC port. Many people turn to emulation due to the price and the amount of DLCs. In this game, Sudachi crashes on startup, and the crash is so severe it froze Windows, forcing me to restart the PC twice using the power button. To me, this is unacceptable, as it could potentially damage the hardware, even if it's rare. This problem also occurs in the Android version of Sudachi. On the other hand, Ryujinx runs the game without any performance or FPS drop issues. Fire Emblem Engage is another game that had many issues on Yuzu until last year. Now, it can be played with both OpenGL and Vulkan. Previously, it could only be run with OpenGL, as Vulkan would freeze during the tutorial. However, on Ryujinx, the game was playable since its release. The engine for this game is problematic for emulation, whether on Switch or 3DS, and there will always be issues with shader compilation the first time you enter a battle. This was evident in both Sudachi and Ryujinx, so we'll ignore this detail. In terms of performance, Sudachi had a higher average but also higher resource consumption. Regarding stutters, both emulators behaved similarly. Remember, when playing this game, you won't be using unlocked FPS like in this test, so the choice of emulator won't make much difference. Fire Emblem Warriors has a poorly optimized Koei engine, making its emulation a significant challenge. Until recently, it was very difficult to run this game without experiencing extreme stutters of more than 10 seconds, making it unplayable. Sudachi fixed this problem, while Ryujinx did so only partially. On Sudachi, compiling shaders for special moves for the first time takes about 1 second. On Ryujinx, however, this can take up to 10 seconds, giving the impression that the game has frozen or the emulator might crash. However, after the first execution of special attacks, the game runs normally. In our performance test, Sudachi performed better, with a higher average and without hitting 0 FPS in our low 1% statistic. I tested Hyrule Warriors, another game developed by Koei. Since it's a Wii U port, it doesn't have as many issues as the previous game. In this test, I used a patch to unlock the game at 60 FPS natively. Even so, we couldn't exceed this rate, so the average FPS remains the same on both emulators. The only point worth mentioning is that the low 1% had a worse result on Ryujinx, indicating that it takes longer to compile shaders. In terms of resource consumption, Sudachi has a slightly higher usage. Kirby and the Forgotten Land also had issues, but only on Ryujinx. Games developed in Unreal Engine have always been problematic to emulate. The problem on Ryujinx occurred when loading mods. I used a mod to remove background blur and depth of field, which are used to save resources on the Switch. However, loading these mods on Ryujinx caused the game not to start. This may make this test unfair, as Sudachi has to render more elements. This game runs with dynamic FPS, so any performance above 30 FPS won't cause slowdowns, and if the FPS exceeds 60, the game won't be accelerated. In terms of performance, Sudachi has a slight edge, being the more recommended option, especially when used with the 60 FPS patch. An excellent game to compare the two emulators and see the real difference between them is Luigi's Mansion 3. This game features very complex lighting, but it has been corrected in both projects. In Sudachi, it rarely produces 100% accurate results, but it's still acceptable. On the other hand, with the 60 FPS patch, we can achieve a steady 60 FPS in Sudachi, while on Ryujinx, we only get close to that. Additionally, the frame time in Ryujinx, despite having received several improvements, remains inconsistent. This emulator has had this issue in most games since I started making videos in 2022, and it still hasn't been fixed. The recommended solution for this problem is to cap the FPS using VSync in your GPU manager. We'll discuss this in the conclusion. As for overall performance, Sudachi outperforms an average FPS, uses hardware resources almost 3 times less, and has fewer stutters, as seen in the low 1% metric. In Metroid Dread, with the 60 FPS patch, performance is significantly better in Sudachi, with lower hardware consumption. The game showed no graphical issues on either emulator. In this case, the performance doesn't even need to be discussed. Sudachi is the clear winner. This game is running at doubled resolution due to the low graphical quality at standard resolution. Metroid Prime Remastered, at launch, was unplayable on both emulators. Every time you opened a door to a new room, there were numerous stutters that froze the game, even with shaders already compiled. This issue was fixed by the Yuzu team, and today, although it still exists, it's much smoother compared to how the game ran previously. On the other hand, Ryujinx also fixed these issues but hasn't received good optimizations yet, and long stutters when entering a new room continue to occur. In terms of performance, Sudachi has the advantage, delivering many more frames. Note that there is high VRM consumption, but this is due to running the game at 2x resolution, as it is quite jagged at its normal resolution. Running Mortal Kombat 1 without updates is still an insane challenge. Although there is a PC version that is now more affordable, the Nintendo Switch version has much lower graphical quality and several issues. Even with updates, the main offline mode is still inaccessible as it relies on an online server. For those who, despite all these obstacles, choose to play this version, be prepared to face many stutters with every character movement. Ryujinx offers less slowdown and is the better option for this game. However, it's worth noting that the game is not recommended for those with only 16 GB of RAM. Monster Hunter Rise is one of the games I frequently get requests to test. Without updates, the game runs very well at 30 FPS. However, for a smoother experience, I recommend using Game Pass or the native PC version, which has been more accessible in digital stores. Regarding emulator comparison, Sudachi showed inconsistent FPS measurements, but I can say that the smoothness is similar to a game running at 30 FPS. However, there were shader compilation issues in Sudachi, resulting in graphical glitches that hindered gameplay, as well as high RAM consumption, nearly reaching 16 GB. If you still insist on playing the Switch version without online support, Ryujinx is the better choice. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, along with its DLCs, is one of the best games for this platform and runs very well on both emulators. However, Sudachi stands out, offering nearly double the performance with significantly lower RAM consumption and more efficient use of hardware resources. There is, however, a problem in Sudachi when playing in multiplayer mode, where a window for configuring controls keeps appearing even when everything is already set up correctly. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, the latest releases for the Switch, are controversial due to gameplay and poor optimization on the original hardware. In the early days of release, the game was unplayable on Yuzu, but this has been fixed, and now the game runs without issues. On Ryujinx, I was able to complete the game a week before the official release as the performance was perfect. In terms of performance, the emulators are evenly matched. Ryujinx offers superior performance in cities and more demanding environments, while Sudachi performs better in more enclosed and lighter environments. A deciding factor for choosing the emulator is the amount of available RAM. If you have less than 16 GB, use Sudachi. If you have at least 24 GB, you can opt for Ryujinx. Pokémon Legends Arceus, unlike Scarlet and Violet, is well optimized, with gameplay that pleased many players, including myself. Although it's not my favorite, the game runs equally well on both emulators. However, Sudachi again stands out, offering excellent performance with no significant graphical issues during gameplay. Finally, Pokémon Sword was the first Switch game I played on emulators. Initially, the game had various random crashes, but it's now playable on both emulators. Historically, the game has always run better on Ryujinx, and this remains true in this test. However, Ryujinx has a relatively high GPU consumption for this game, and long gaming sessions with just 16 GB of RAM can still cause random crashes. Another issue with Ryujinx, which I'm not sure if it has been fixed, is related to the passage of time in the game. There is a quest where you send a group of Pokemon to complete a task in exchange for XP for the group sent, but time simply didn't pass in Ryujinx. If you have any information on the fix for this problem, please share it in the comments. Pokémon Tournament DX is a fighting game that brings Pokémon into intense battles. In this game, Ryujinx stands out, offering much better performance than Sudachi. Sudachi ends up consuming GPU resources excessively, while Ryujinx not only delivers better performance but also makes more efficient use of hardware. While the native PC version has not yet been released, it can be played on Nintendo Switch emulators. This is currently the best method, and if you want, I can make a dedicated video on this game, as the previous one I did was when Yuzu was still active. In terms of performance, Sudachi excels with lower RAM consumption, more hardware headroom, and delivers nearly 10 FPS more on average. Additionally, Ryujinx's frame time is completely unstable. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is a challenge for emulation due to the number of shaders needed for each character with their extensive movesets. I completed the campaign mode on Ryujinx because when I played, the World of Light mode didn't work on Yuzu, but now it has been fixed, and you can also play this mode on Sudachi. If you choose Ryujinx, be aware that the emulator may cause random crashes due to memory leaks, typically occurring every hour depending on the amount of available RAM and DRM. On Sudachi, I played for several hours without encountering this problem. In terms of performance, Sudachi shows much better results and does not suffer from random crashes, so if possible, go with Sudachi. Super Mario Odyssey is the emblem of the Switch, offering the best the platform has to offer. This is a complete game that every Mario fan should experience. To test this game, we conducted 2 tests. The first was in Metroid Kingdom, known for being the most hardware demanding due to the city's rendered quality. Here, Ryujinx has the advantage with about a 10% gain compared to Sudachi. The second test was in Cascade Kingdom, the second kingdom you're transported to, and again Ryujinx performed better. Super Mario Wonder is for fans of platform games, featuring several new mechanics and considerable replay value. Comparing performance on both emulators, Sudachi stands out with excellent performance, but you can play this game on whichever project you prefer, as standard gameplay at 60 FPS works well on both. Sonic Frontiers has already had a dedicated video on the channel, but testing it again, I found that everything has changed. We still face issues running Vulkan on Sudachi, leading to low performance and random crashes. Sudachi's OpenGL mode works, but there are objects, like rocks and balloons, that are not rendered, making the player appear stuck on an invisible wall when it's actually an unrendered rock. On Ryujinx, the situation is even worse, with the emulator crashing randomly regardless of what you do. Sonic Superstars runs with dynamic FPS, meaning that any value above 30 FPS will provide decent performance, which is great for benchmarks. In about 5 minutes of testing, Sudachi achieved a 30% higher result than Ryujinx, which is not surprising, as Sudachi has performed better in most games requiring less hardware. Super Mario 3D World is one of the lighter Switch games, ported directly from the Wii U. Running it at an extremely high FPS rate is easy for any emulator, so it doesn't make much difference which project you use, as both deliver constant 60 FPS without issues. However, if you're curious about the test results, Sudachi performs slightly better. Now, talking about The Witcher 3, which I consider the best game I've ever played. Unfortunately, the Switch version is quite weak, full of downgrades. Many people with modest PCs still hope to play this version, but unfortunately, both Ryujinx and Sudachi have severe graphical issues that harm gameplay. In Sudachi, these errors are even more pronounced, making the game nearly unplayable. Due to Sudachi's inability to render the game correctly, comparing performance between the two doesn't make sense. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is another game with questionable Switch port quality, and is very difficult to run decently on emulators. I tried several times on Ryujinx with no success. However, I managed to run it on Sudachi, with all elements present, but the game suffers from frequent slowdowns and low visual quality. To improve visual quality, increasing the resolution is necessary, which causes even more slowdowns. Unlike its predecessor, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has decent rendering and can be considered playable even without mods at 30 FPS. The visual quality is good, and there are no major issues, even in large areas full of enemies. However, I had problems with mod compatibility on Ryujinx, only managing to enable the 60 FPS mod on Sudachi. Therefore, you can use whichever emulator you prefer, as long as your PC meets the system requirements. However, if you want to play at 60 FPS, Sudachi is the most recommended choice. In Sudachi version 1.0.2, Yoshi's Crafted World had issues, being playable only with the OpenGL API. This has since been fixed, and Vulkan is now supported as well. The game runs very well and has no visual issues on either emulator. In terms of performance, Sudachi again takes the lead, but in the end, it doesn't make much difference, as you'll be able to run the game at the maximum FPS rate, and it will end up being accelerated, as shown in the recording. Another game that had issues with mods on Ryujinx was The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Even testing without mods, the game wouldn't start on Ryujinx, even after using 2 different copies. For now, I've only managed to play it on Sudachi. However, before you rush to grab your Switch copy, know that this platform is the worst for playing Breath of the Wild. The ideal platform for this is Cemu, which can perform up to 3 times better than Sudachi. If you want to know more, I'll leave a card with the video I made last week discussing the best versions of Cemu. Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is one of the most sought-after games for the system, being the direct sequel to Breath of the Wild. Since its release, it has always run better on Yuzu and later on Sudachi. Today, Ryujinx has received several improvements but still lags behind Sudachi, especially due to the range of mods available for Sudachi, which are incompatible with Ryujinx. To capture the gameplay, I had to disable some mods in Ryujinx because, even using the same ROM, mods, and versions, there were factors preventing Ryujinx from running the game with the mods I wanted. As you can see in our performance graphs, Sudachi still has a considerable advantage when compared directly to Now, specifically about Sudachi, the project's developer has been involved in many controversies and emu drama, provoking other developers with various accusations. It's such a heavy case that I prefer not to comment much here, but it does tarnish the emulation scene, especially for those outside of this world who just download an emulator occasionally to play a specific game. Despite this, Sudachi is already at an advanced stage and seems to have sidelined Yuzu, with improvements in various games and fixing RAM leaks that Yuzu suffered from early on. This shows that the developer knows what they're doing but insists that everyone is copying their project. On the other hand, all this drama seems to consume time that could be invested in updates for Sudachi, which is maintained by a single developer. Sometimes updates take more than 2 months to be released, leading some people to confuse Sudachi with a project that has ended, but I can assure you it's still under development. About Ryujinx, when they say that this project is based on accuracy, believe me, it really is. But the question I leave is, do you prefer a game running a bit slower but more like the Switch, or a project running at full speed, even if with some minor issues, like with Shadows, for example? Personally, I prefer something that runs more smoothly over something extremely faithful. As with the hardware we have today, this quest for accuracy might be unfeasible in some games. Ryujinx recently underwent a UI update, but compared to other projects like PCSX2, Dolphin, and Citra, it still seems to lack specific per-game configuration implementation. You can modify various aspects like mods, updates, and cheats, but graphical settings are always considered global, which can be inconvenient. Another long-standing issue, which has only seen improvements but has never been fully fixed, is the unstable frame time. You can address this by setting up a custom VSync in your GPU software, but having to change this every time you want a game to run at 30 or 60 FPS can be quite annoying. So, folks, help me make this video popular. I've been working on it for 3 whole days and still need nearly another day to edit and do all the voice capturing. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.